have the pleasure to talk about toddler sociability now. And I would like to give a little bit of a child development context and then talk through the definitions and the relevance of social development in toddlers. We'll then talk about how those social skills emerge and develop and tap into the underlying brain maturation, which will be wrapped up by the key messages. So, in general, typical toddler and childhood development comprises three main domains of development with sensory motor, cognitive language, and social emotional domains. And in all of those domains, we see a continuous learning process in infants and young children where they gain skills in those different areas of sensory motor, cognitive language, social and emotional abilities. And social and emotional skills, they start developing very early in life. Most parents will remember the social smile, the first smile, when the infant really shows and starts its bonding with parents, and then progresses throughout childhood and toddlerhood when children start connecting with, with other family members, and then in preschool years start expanding their relationships to peers, teachers, people outside of their immediate family. And it's really a foundational piece of development that is embedded in cognitive language and adaptive life skill development. So a young child's development of social competencies really is critical for them to participate in a range of social activities and in a range of home-based but also community-based environments. And those social environments, especially during toddlerhood, they continue to grow exponentially and all the way into adolescence and into our adult lives. So what do we mean by social emotional development? Healthy social and emotional development really refers to a child's capacity to experience, manage, and express a full range of both positive and negative emotions, but also to develop close and satisfying relationships with others. So that's the sociability aspect, but then also to actively explore environments and really enable them to learn. So we really have a close relationship between social competencies and emotional competencies. So therefore, a lot of times it's referred to as social-emotional development. We can also see this when development starts deviating from normal developmental trajectories. For example, if a preschooler does not learn to identify and label their emotions, then a lot of times we see tantrums, and it escalates into tantrums. Now, of course, there is also a lot of, there's a notion of social acceptance or, community acceptance to certain things, which is bound to age a lot of times. So it's probably still acceptable for a 2-year-old to throw a tantrum in a supermarket, and it's less accepted for most 8-year-olds to throw a tantrum in a supermarket. So it's really important that we integrate those kind of basic skills that we start developing into more complex skills and abilities. The areas of social-emotional functioning are really not like super well defined. It's a bit of a broader range and area of abilities, but I'd like to share the ones in the Ages and Stages questionnaire that's focused on social-emotional development, so ASQ2E, where we talk about different domains as part of social-emotional functioning, including the ability to calm down and to adjust to environmental stimulation, which is linked to self-regulation. Here you also see a close link to executive functions, which are cognitive functions, but self-regulation is really an important bridging competency. It also entails the ability to conform to the direction of others, which again is important for if you think about preschool and school settings. So here we talk about compliance. There's adaptive functioning. There's the ability to demonstrate own feelings and empathy for others, which is linked to the domain of affect. And social communication, of course, plays an important role. And then sociability and interaction is really linked to the ability to respond or to initiate social responses to parents, to other adults, to peers. Another important domain is the development of independence, so the ability to self-initiate or to respond without any guidance, which really is a critical part of autonomy. So now, why is sociability and social skill development particularly relevant during toddlerhood? Now, during that age range, children are faced with, with various social challenges characterized by, most importantly, the transition from a very familiar environment, usually at home, to a peer-dominated environment in preschool or school settings. So they have to not only get along with their own parents, with their moms or their primary caretakers, they now also have to get along, with a whole range of people outside of their familiar environments. Therefore, they must develop those self-regulation and social competency skills to really have a smooth interaction. A lot, again, of that is being learned, so it's all part of development to also be exposed to it, to face some challenges and to learn how to handle them. So therefore, preschool age and toddlerhood is a really sensitive period for the development of those social competencies. And the other way around, like once we look at, if things do not develop appropriately, that's when we usually see also the relevance of a certain age or developmental stage. So, for instance, in a US survey of more than 3,000 teachers, it came out that 30% of the kindergarten teachers reported that more than half of the children in their classes not only lacked academic skills, but also had difficulties following directions and working in a group. So 20% of them reported that more than half of the class actually had problems with social skills. So adjusting to a listener, just being able to apologize, understanding social cues, processing them, and adapt behaviors accordingly are really critical skills. And they are particularly important because studies have also shown that for long-term impact, this is like those competencies and the level of that development of social emotional skills is linked to school readiness, it's linked to later academic skills, emotional well-being, the ability to adapt in school, conflict management. Again, those are all skills also that we need later on in adulthood, managing conflicts, managing people, showing certain leadership behaviors. It's important for life satisfaction, to have these meaningful and satisfying relationships, for example. It's also linked to responsible and ethical decision-making, which again, especially on a societal level, is an important skill, mental health and workplace functioning. Interestingly, we see some studies indicating that once you start comparing it to the impact of IQ on, for instance, later occupational outcome, you really find that social emotional skills are almost as influential. So coming back to what I was saying earlier about the three major developmental domains, it's really not sufficient to just excel in one of them. Ideal development really entails the cognitive, the motor, and the social emotional developmental domains. When we now look at how those social skills and social emotional competencies come online and how they develop, we have to acknowledge that it's a major developmental task and that it's a central component of generally healthy functioning of toddlers. And the development really progresses along a developmental trajectory, which is not linear. I'll come to that in the next slide. It's really an interaction with these other domains and with physical growth, physical development, cognitive development. And it is marked by a continuum of milestones. Milestones being like really physical skills or behaviors that you achieve at a certain point in time. And this is usually what also primary caretakers or teachers get to see on the behavioral level. So when we look at the age range from 1 to 5 years, so say toddler, preschool age range, we really see a massive progression from a child that is more or less passively entertained, interacts a little bit at about 1 year of life, but then autonomy and independence really start emerging, and they turn into a 3-year-old toddler that starts playing mostly still parallel little, but then they start interacting with other children, and they then develop into a 5-year-old that really collaboratively, you know, participates in activities. They play together, they come up with ideas, they add on to each other's ideas. They really now start to also understand rules and directions much better, of course, which also plays a role on the cognitive level. But they're also much better able to now control their impulses. They have now an understanding of gender roles, of peer relationships. So you really see the progression. And again, it's not one or the other, and it's not linear, the development. It's really skills we develop you know, as a foundation, rather basic at first, and they develop into more and more complex behaviors. And that complex behavioral development and those changes that we see in our children and toddlers is really accompanied by changes in the brain, and particularly in how the brain connects. So we know that the brain doesn't just continue growing in size and weight after birth, right? It most importantly grows in complexity. It builds networks, and it keeps developing these critical brain connections that enable the brain and the different areas of the brain to communicate with each other, which is critical for complex behaviors like these social emotional skills. So the increase in a child's cooperative or collaborative behaviors and social, you know, literally social connections with other children is orchestrated by an increase in internal connections, like the connections we have in our brains. So it's linked to like functional connectivity, as I was saying, building those networks, but also there are processes that are linked to those connections, like myelination, meaning the wrapping of our fiber pathways in the brain with a lipid-rich sheet with myelin. In turn, again, if things do not go, you know, according to the developmental trajectories, we see that brain connectivity deficits are often also linked with social, like in specific areas of the brain that you know, process the social information part. That is linked to also abnormal social cognition. So we can see this, for instance, in autism spectrum disorders, but also other disturbances and conditions. So essentially, we have a social brain that is not just social because all those different brain areas literally collaborate and work together, but it also is social. We also have brain areas that are really dedicated to processing that social information and those social cues, and then regulate how we respond to those. And those specific brain areas, if you look at them, you'll see that there are some areas like amygdala that are already quite early, well developed, specialized emotion areas. But then a lot of those areas that process social information actually come online a bit later, and like now become you know, more connected and more online during toddlerhood and childhood. So we're really talking about also superior temporal sulcus, anterior cingulate cortex, specific areas of the prefrontal cortex, inferior frontal gyrus, and anterior insular and amygdala, as just mentioned. When we look at myelination in those brain areas, and this is now unpublished data, but based on a huge birth cohort, the ECHO cohort, we actually again see, similar to the behavior where we saw those trajectories of continuous milestones, we now see in the brain also an increase of myelin. In the graph, you see the myelin water fraction, so a surrogate marker of myelin content in the brain, and how it really has a spurt, an increase in development between 1 and 3 years of life, and then seems to plateau out a little bit towards 5 years of life, but it continues developing. So if we quantify it, we actually see like a 97% increase from 1 to 3 years, and then a continuous increase of about 17% to 5 years of age. So as I was saying, while we're building those connections with other people, we're also building connections internally in our brains. So the key messages of today's talk are really around social skills development being fundamental to success in school, life, health, and well-being. And also, they have several layers. There are several domains that are part of social skills. One of them being sociability, really how we connect with others. Another one being autonomy, really how we develop our independence. It's important for self-care. And they emerge during infancy, but then continue developing really throughout childhood and adolescence, which is a period of life where social interactions and social learning environments really grow exponentially. So social skills and our social behaviors, they mature alongside the connections in our brains. And all those connectivity processes are really crucial for processing social information and regulating those behaviors. Particularly during toddlerhood, we see a significant increase in myelination in the brain, which is found overall, obviously, in the brain, but particularly, as you saw, in those specific areas linked to the regulation, coordination of social behaviors. And myelination, so the wrapping of the fiber pathways in the brain with myelin, really supports that fast and efficient information processing and underpins those complex social behaviors, because we need to make sure that the different areas of our brain that are all needed to regulate something complex, like social, emotional, cue reading, interpretation, and behavior, really depends on a fast and efficient communication in the brain. So with that, thank you very much for listening.